Now, I understand there's a bit going on this graph, but over the last 5 weeks, we've seen God's plan unfold as follows. We started with his people Israel in exile, down the bottom there, only to return under Cyrus as prophesied. We've seen the domination of Alexander the Great as foretold by Daniel the prophet. And we're going to see next week the way that God used Jesus Christ to set in stone the salvation of his people. A Jew, an Israelite, who drew away from the religious leaders of his time and created what at the time was a separate movement, but from the beginning of time had been the movement that God intended all along. And just 300 years after Jesus Christ, we saw Constantine the Great merging politics with religion and drawing the vast bulk of Christianity to the religion of the Roman Empire, which by that time we must say had become wildly convergent from the teachings of Christ. And while the Roman Empire subsequently fell, the Catholic Church continued on strong, persecuting both the Jews and also true Christians and any who sought to use their Bibles to read for themselves. But that persecution, God said, would be limited. And we saw in the revelation of Jesus Christ over the last 2 weeks how God used both Napoleon and Martin Luther, among others, to influence through Martin Luther a revival of reading the Bible, of learning more about God from what God said rather than what the church said. The Protestant movement, effectively. And through Napoleon, we saw how he destroyed the political power of the church by splintering and weakening the church's political power over states and over Europe. But throughout, the fortunes of his people, the Jews, remained perilous. And what we're going to see tonight is God's plan to regather his people back into the homeland that he gave to their ancestors. And as the Apostle Paul writes, when questioned about whether or not Israel, the natural state, had been cast off by God entirely for their rejection of his son, he says, I say then, has God cast away his people? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin. God hath not cast away his people which he foreknew. And later on in that same chapter of Romans, I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And so all Israel shall be saved. As it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. Israel is definitely still in the plans of God. And in looking at that tonight, we're going to particularly focus on the man Theodor Herzl, a Jew who lived in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, who was instrumental in kicking off the rebirth of this nation. So what we're going to consider tonight, first of all, who was this man, Theodor Herzl? And then subsequently, what biblical evidence have we that God used him? How do we know that God wanted Israel back in their own land? And why, finally, we're going to look at, does Israel need to be back in their own land for the broader picture of God's plan? So, who was Theodor Herzl? Theodor Herzl was an Austro-Hungarian Jew, which at the time, obviously not many of us know where Austro-Hungary is. That's because it doesn't exist anymore. At the time, there was a multinational constitutional monarchy between both Austria and Hungary, termed the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the countries, or the empire, split after World War I. So he lived in a town in the centre there known as, at the time, as Pest, now known as Budapest. His occupation was many things. He was a journalist, a lawyer, a writer, a playwright, and a political activist. And he lived from May 1860 to July 1904, just 44 years. Some of his notable achievements, which we're going to cover off on tonight. First of all, he formed the Zionist organization, which was to promote Jewish immigration in the first instance to Palestine, and then to try and raise enough political support to form a Jewish state. He's also specifically mentioned in the Israeli Declaration of Independence in 1948 as one of the people that's instrumental in the founding of Israel. And he is to this day referred to as the spiritual father of the Jewish state. So some context. Throughout time, particularly in Europe, Jews had faced significant anti-Semitism and often persecution. In fact, for 1800 years or so, since the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And during the 19th century in particular, there was a number of events that meant there was a lot of discussion amongst the Jews of the day in Europe and also amongst the political parties about what to do with the Jews. There were pogroms in Russia. There was the segregation of Jewish communities into specific suburbs to keep them away from others. And that was perhaps highlighted, perhaps most obviously, by the well-known case in France of Captain Alfred Dreyfus in 1894, a man who was subsequently, it's believed, falsely accused and convicted of treachery because he was a Jew. There were two options for the Jews of the time. The first was assimilation, essentially becoming part of the nation and the identity of the places that they lived in throughout Europe and also through to Asia. But there were some significant problems with that issue, with that option. The Jews had kept their identity as Jews for nearly 2,000 years at this point, despite being scattered throughout Europe. You could almost say that assimilation had been happening for 1,800 years and no assimilation had been successful. And of course, anti-Semitism itself had exacerbated the problem because the nations that they were living in wouldn't let them forget that they were Jews. And it was constantly being used as a label for them, and the minority populations of Jews therefore banded together as much as anything to keep their to keep themselves safe, which further kept their Jewish identity strong. The second idea was for nationalism, which after Herzl's efforts became known as Zionism. But this also had some significant hurdles because, well, where were they to go? No one was particularly keen to just give up land for this new state of Israel. And suggestions over time included many different areas, including Kenya, Argentina, Cyprus, Mesopotamia, Mozambique, and the Sinai Peninsula. There was also significant issues amongst the Jews themselves. Many felt that because it was so difficult to convince, or it was so almost unachievable to have their own homeland, that to push for their own homeland was going to make themselves more obvious. And so assimilation would be even harder if people were pushing for this idea. And so the Jewish opposition to this idea was actually quite strong. And so into this division, Theodor Herzl was born. His family lived next to one of the synagogues in Pest. His family was very wealthy. His father, Jacob, was a very successful businessman. His mother's name was Jeanette and his older sister, Pauline. However, his sister, Pauline, actually died of typhus when she was only 19 years old. And because of this tragedy in the family, his family moved to Vienna from Budapest or Pest. Now, Herzl himself was very ambitious. He initially wanted to be a great engineer. He wanted to follow in the footsteps of a hero of the time, Ferdinand de Lesseps, who built the Suez Canal. But he didn't succeed subsequently in the sciences, so he thought, I'm not cut out for this. So instead took on literature and the humanities, and he became a journalist and a playwright. Interestingly enough, knowing subsequent history around the area and particularly the Germans, Herzl actually idolized German society, and he saw that as the pinnacle of European culture. He embraced their ideals whereby you could increase your morality by reading great works of literature and therefore recognizing more and appreciating more the beautiful things in life. And he idolized this society so much that he actually modeled his future state of Israel on the society. After studying law then at the University of Vienna and for a very brief time practicing law, he became a journalist for a Viennese newspaper and a correspondent for a French news company, which was named the New Free Press in Paris. And he occasionally made special trips to London on one side and then also across to Istanbul. So he's quite well travelled throughout Europe. But it was around this time that a very influential man came to power in Vienna. His name was Karl Lueger, and he formed what's called the Christian Social Party in the year 1893. He was himself a revolutionary politician, and he dreamed of making the perfect society, except he had a different idea than Herzl about the perfect society. His perfect society, everyone was Catholic, and he had huge support from the then current Pope Leo XIII, who lobbied the government or the emperor on his behalf, and he helped him become the mayor of Vienna by personally interceding on his behalf. But there was only one problem with this. The perfect society that he dreamed of was free of Jews. Sounds quite a parallel between Hitler, you might say, and that is quite correct because Hitler actually stated this man as one of his inspirations. Sorry, excuse me. And so he started using the Jews and the Jewish question as part of his political campaigns. He started earning popularity with the tradespeople at the time who were competing with the Jews in business and used that angst to gain a following. But he doesn't actually appear to have led any great persecution against the Jews. He just used anti-Semitism as a means of popularity. Interestingly, he himself had some friends who were Jews. And when some people asked him about this, he is recorded as saying, I get to decide who is a Jew. But this didn't stop him being specifically described, as I said, by Hitler as one of his inspirations. But Herzl saw the risk here. And it was at this time that Herzl wrote his play, The New Ghetto. This was a play which showed the lack of real security and the equality of even the well-to-do Jews in Vienna. And it was targeted at the Jews. The protagonist is an assimilated Jewish lawyer who tries unsuccessfully time and again to break through the social ghetto that was enforced on the Jews in that area. And by this time, Herzl himself had shifted his opinion. Previously, he had been pro-assimilation. Perhaps he theorized into one of the German-speaking societies. But now he realized that anti-Semitism was not something that you could stop. It was only something you could avoid. And so he turned his attention to advocating for a separate Jewish state. And in 1895, he wrote in his diary, "In Paris, as I have said, I achieved a freer attitude toward anti-Semitism. Above all, I recognized the emptiness and futility of trying to combat anti-Semitism." It was at this point that his editors at the New Free Press refused any publication of his Zionist political activities. And so in late 1895, he wrote his famous book, the Judenstaat, or The State of the Jews. And that was published in 1896 to immediate acclaim and controversy, obviously acclaim from the Zionists, controversy from the assimilationists. And the book argued that the Jewish people should leave Europe for Palestine, their historic homeland. He said that the Jews possessed the nationality already. All they were missing was a nation and a state of their own. He wrote this: "The Jewish question persists wherever Jews live in appreciable numbers. Wherever it does not exist, it is brought in together with Jewish immigrants. We are naturally drawn to those places where we are not persecuted, and our appearance there gives rise to persecution. This is the case and will inevitably be so everywhere, even in highly civilized countries, see for instance France, so long as the Jewish question is not solved on the political level." And the book concludes, "Therefore, I believe that a wondrous generation of Jews will spring into existence. The Maccabeans will rise again. And let me repeat once more my opening words. The Jews who wish for a state will have it. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil and die peacefully in our own homes. The world will be freed by our liberty, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness, and whatever we attempt there to accomplish for our own welfare will react powerfully and beneficially for the good of humanity." So he was really quite a visionary in that sense, but we're going to see that he was actually quite realistic in some of the goals that he set out to do, and was willing to essentially take any course if it resulted in, he was quite pragmatic in his attempts to achieve this outcome. So he then began to, basically became a political activist. And he began a whirlwind diplomatic effort throughout Europe to try to achieve the goal of a return to Palestine. In 1895, he met with the Maccabeans group in Britain, which was another Zionist movement, and he convinced them of his plan. In the same year, he pitched a Jewish state to a French Jewish banker who you may know, who was already funding colonies in Palestine himself. His name, Edmund James de Rothschild. In 1896, he then visited the Anglican minister to the British embassy in Vienna, where he lived. And through that connection, he was arranged to meet with the uncle of the German emperor. That man was Frederick I, Grand Duke of Baden. And in 1890, 1 month later, the Judenstaat was published in Britain in English. Another month later in Istanbul, this time with the assistance of Count Philip Michael von Wetnewlinski, a Polish immigrant with political contacts in the Ottoman court, Herzl attempted for the first time to meet the Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, in order to present his solution of a Jewish state to the Sultan directly, because obviously the Ottoman Empire at the time was directly in control of the area of Palestine. He wasn't successful. He couldn't meet with the Sultan directly at that time, but he met with the Grand Vizier instead, and he presented his proposal that essentially tried to bribe the Ottoman Empire by saying, well, there's a fairly well-known thing that Jews have in the area at the time, particularly the Rothschilds, that is money. There's something that Ottomans clearly do not have, that is money. How about we pay off your foreign debt in exchange for Palestine? Was not successful, unfortunately. In 1896, another month later, he was back in London and he addressed a large Yiddish-speaking community of Jews who had emigrated from Europe and was bringing them on board. So you can see throughout all of this, he's jumping between political entities and Jews. He's trying to raise the profile of Zionism politically, and he's also trying, on the other hand, to increase the the ideal for the Jews and get support from them to push for this idea wherever they lived and to push their governments to do the same. In 1897, he paid a significant sum to set up his own newspaper named Die Welt, which means the world. And in 1897, he convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, and he was elected president of that organization. A year later, he publicly met with the German Emperor, or the Kaiser Wilhelm II, who actually was the last Kaiser because he was deposed after World War I due to the unsuccess of that campaign, and because he was blamed for some rash assurances that he made to the Austro-Hungarian Empire around their security. In 1898, he again met with the German Emperor in Jerusalem, actually, which added to the international recognition of Zionism throughout the world, because the Germans were quite a powerhouse at the time. A year later, in 1899, the mayor of Jerusalem actually, and this just shows, I guess, the groundswell of support that had come for Herzl, mayor of Jerusalem sent him a letter essentially saying this is a bad idea. All the Arabs in Jerusalem and the area around are going to increase their anti-Semitism if you move here, which sounds about right. Actually, what we can see in hindsight actually happened. And then in 1901, he finally met with Sultan Abdul Hamid II of the Ottoman Empire, who, as we said, was in dire financial straits. However, he turned down Herzl's offer to consolidate the Ottoman debt in exchange for a charter allowing them access to Palestine. And this meeting actually was quite controversial at the time, because the Jews, the Sultan had been fairly lenient towards people who were showing great anti-Semitism to the Jews in his protectorate. And so a lot of the Jews from Europe were quite unhappy with Herzl for actually meeting with him in the first place. In 1902, he gave evidence before the British Royal Commission into Alien Immigration, and he had close contact with the then Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain. And Joseph Chamberlain was the man who initially raised the idea of what was at the time called the Uganda Project, which and also of the Sinai Peninsula being used as potential alternative areas that they could live in. The Sinai Peninsula idea was blocked by the Egyptians, and so the Uganda Project was then taken as the best option going forward. And in 1903, at the 6th Zionist Congress, so we've already, we saw a couple of years earlier, there was the first. They've had 3 or 4 in between now, and we've got the 6th. And here, Herzl himself presented the idea of a temporary refuge for the Jews in British East Africa, but that was soundly rejected at the time. And in 1903, he tried to reach Pope Pius X to see if he could gain his support for Palestine, particularly because of for the Russian Jews that were at the time fleeing from the pogroms in Russia. And one of the cardinals at the time ordained that as long as the Jews denied the divinity of Christ, the Catholics couldn't even make a declaration in their favour, let alone support any move that they made. So he went to Russia. 1903, he visited St. Petersburg, and he was received by the finance minister and the minister of the interior, but both of them had very anti-Jewish responses to his call. And then finally in 1904, he did meet with Pope Pius X at the Holy See in Rome, and the Pope was apparently very respectful, but resolutely refused to support Zionism in any way. So you can see quite a whirlwind tour of dignitaries and political entities that he spoke to. But it was that very same year, at the age of 44, that he died in Lower Austria. And the day before his death, he told Reverend Heckler, who was the Anglican reverend to the British Embassy in Vienna, he told him, "Greet Palestine for me. I gave my heart's blood for my people." And in his will, he repeated the desire of the Jewish forebear Joseph, who he said, I wish to be buried in the vault beside my father here, and to lie there till the Jewish people can take my remnants to Israel. And you can see on the screen there his idea of, or his very rough sketch of what he thought a Jewish flag might look like, with 6 stars arranged around in very similar sort of shape as to what you might see the Star of David flag today. And actually in 1949, after the Independence War, his body was reinterred. So it was taken from there to a mountain near Jerusalem. And that mountain today has 2 names. The first name is a name essentially meaning Memorial Mountain. And the second is Har Herzl, or Mount Herzl. And it contains a cemetery there for the fallen service members of the Israeli army, and he's buried there with them. The coffin that he was buried in was draped in blue and white. It was decorated with the Star of David, with a Lion of Judah and 7 gold stars in sort of a memory of his original proposal for a flag of the state. In the end, what was it all for? Well, it was all for the establishment of the state of Israel. And just 13 years later, in 1917, the British government itself declared that this was a priority. And then 30 years later, in 1948, became a reality. This can obviously partly be put down to his efforts. So what did he achieve? Most importantly, he unified the Jewish movement and helped them agree on the idea of resettlement in Palestine and the setting up of Israel as a political entity again, no more assimilation. And he began the process of lobbying the various governments, as we've seen, quite hard to support Zionism. Essentially, he convinced the world that not only would the Jews be better off because they would be away from all this anti-Semitism, but those who were anti-Semitic would be better off because the Jews wouldn't be there either. And so in this way, he was a visionary who was instrumental in convincing the Jews and various parts of the world that the only solution to what was then termed the Jewish problem was a return to their historic land. Now, I won't go into any of his family history or anything like that. He had quite a sad family history if you were going to look it up yourselves. But I guess the main point that we're trying to get across here is that he was a small cog, but a significant cog in the return of the nation of Israel. So that's Theodor Herzl. I now want to turn to look at the question, how do we know that God used him? How do we know that that God wanted Israel to be back in their land? In hindsight, we can sit here today and say, well, we know that the return happened. We can see Israel as a nation. But was this something that God directed, or was this something that God foretold? And for the remainder of our time tonight, we're going to be going through the various scatterings and regatherings, prophecies of the Bible to show how Israel does fit into God's plan. And I'm hoping that you'll see how Israel being around today is a remarkable and incredible sign that God's plan is on track. It is happening. So the return of the Jews. This is something that's a recurring theme of the Bible, partly because the Jews were kicked out of their land so frequently, but entirely due to some promises that God made to them at the very beginning of their nationhood. If you'll come across with me to Genesis chapter 13, I want to just briefly touch on this first promise that God made to the respected father of the nation of Israel, Abraham. Genesis 13, and we're going to be reading from verse 13 to 15. Sorry, verse 14 to 15. Genesis 13, verse 14. The Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art, northward, southward, eastward, and westward, for all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. So right from here, right from the very beginning of the nation, when there was just one man and his wife, God had promised this area to Abraham and to his seed forever. And while that obviously doesn't prove that God would return them to the land in 1948 specifically, it does show his intention that at some point this land will be Israel's forever. And he spoke later also to the newly formed nation as they were about to conquer the land of Israel. If you come back with me to Jeremiah chapter 16, where we read from tonight. Jeremiah 16 is at a point where the nation had transgressed God's commandments. They had sinned against him, they hadn't obeyed him. And I've got up on the screen here Deuteronomy chapter 29. Deuteronomy 29 is just as the nation has been formed into a national identity. And they've been given some commandments by God. They've been given a promise of entering into this land of Canaan then, of Palestine or Israel today. And in this promise, there is a promise of cursing, essentially, if they disobeyed God's commandments. And I've got that up on the screen there. Essentially, God said, I'll cast you out of my land if you don't obey me and if you transgress my commandments. And you'll see the same thing is repeated to us in Jeremiah chapter 16, where in verse 12, ye have done worse than your fathers. Behold, ye walk everyone after the imagination of his evil heart, that they may not hearken unto me. Verse 13, therefore will I cast you out of this land into a land that ye know not, neither ye nor your fathers. So essentially, this is the outworking of the promise that God made to the nation back in Deuteronomy chapter 29. While this warning was here in Deuteronomy 29, God also made a promise to them in the very next chapter. He said, it shall come to pass when all these things are come upon thee, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before thee, and thou shalt call them to mind among all the nations whither you've been driven because of your disobedience, and at that time you return to the Lord thy God, then the Lord thy God will turn thy captivity and have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from the nations whither he has scattered thee. And if any of thine be driven out unto the utmost parts of heaven, from thence will the Lord thy God gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee. And the Lord thy God will bring thee back into the land which thy fathers possessed, and thou shalt possess it, and he will do thee good and multiply thee above thy fathers. And it's repeated here again in Jeremiah chapter 16, where he says in verse 15, or verse 14 and 15, no longer is it going to be said, this is the Lord your God which brought you out of Egypt, but verse 15, the Lord liveth that brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north and from all the lands whither he had driven them, and I'll bring them again into their land that I gave unto the fathers. So essentially, God in this prophecy of Jeremiah is repeating the promise and the curse that he made in Deuteronomy 29 and 30. These things all happened. The Babylonians took them all away, and as we saw a couple of weeks ago, Cyrus then allowed and assisted them to return. Rome subsequently banished them from Israel in AD 70, and Britain allowed them to return in 1948. But you might say, how do we know which prophecies in the Bible relate to each of these different returns? Perhaps God only promised that first return. Perhaps this one here in Jeremiah 17, where the people were taken away by Babylon and returned. Perhaps God only promised that first return, and the second one was just a coincidence that was brought about by the Jews lobbying for that position. Are we just recycling these prophecies as an attempt to inflate what these prophecies are speaking about? And I understand it's quite a difficult and a remarkable concept that God has promised more than one captivity and return. And because Israel and Jerusalem and the Jewish people have been taken into captivity and returned a couple of times, it can feel quite difficult in the Bible to determine which return is being spoken about. So I first want to nail down the different returns here, the different captivities and the different returns, because I think it's important to understand the history of Jewish displacement in order to understand how each individual prophecy fits into these. And we're going to look subsequently at the quotes that show these captivities and these returns. So broadly, we have 3 captivities and 3 returns. The first captivity we've just spoken about. Israel, the 10 tribes in the north, and parts of Judah were taken into captivity by the nation of Assyria in 721 BC. Judah, the 2 tribes in the south of the land, and particularly Jerusalem, were taken into captivity to Babylon by the Babylonians around 597 BC. And then we have history recorded for us. The first return, Judah was restored and returned under Cyrus. The second captivity, major captivity, happened in AD 70, where Judah and Jerusalem were sacked by the Romans, who were sick and tired of the political unrest in the area, and they were scattered throughout the Roman world and beyond. And then we have, as we know, in standing at our vantage point, the second return in 1948 and 1967, where the nation of Israel was reestablished and then the city of Jerusalem was retaken. Now, I understand that there is, between AD 70 and 1948, there were a number of times that the Jews did control Jerusalem, but they were short-lived and they never really had any political power. So we've disregarded those for this exercise tonight. There will be, I say, a third captivity. And this one I've referred to as the latter years captivity. And then there will be a third return under the newly established king in Jerusalem, Jesus Christ. Now, I don't think we particularly need to prove those first or those second captivities. They're pretty accurately recorded in history and throughout the Bible, and I'm happy to provide biblical evidence for those if you're interested. The first return is also documented by the writings of Ezra and Nehemiah, so we're not going to deal with that. But even that first return was prophesied before it happened. In Jeremiah chapter 29, "Thus says the Lord, that after 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word in causing to you to return to this place." Verse 14, "I will gather you from all the nations and from all the places whither I have driven you, and I will bring you again into the place whence I caused you to be carried away captive." And Daniel the prophet, one of those who was carried away captive, verified that this was indeed a prophecy that the people of the captivity were relying on in Daniel chapter 9, verse 2. And because the Bible spans that gap, we can see the recording of the return of the Jews under Cyrus. We can look at and we looked at that a few weeks ago, and in the book of Ezra and in the book of Isaiah. But a few hundred years later, the returned nation of Israel under Cyrus, now under the rule of the Romans, rejected their Messiah, Jesus Christ. They effectively forced the Romans to crucify him, and for their rejection, they were once again sent into captivity. And again, this was foretold by Jesus Christ before it happened, before his death. First, that the captivity would be a direct result of their rejection to him in Luke chapter 20, with the parable that he spake at the time, where the Lord of the vineyard, representing God, asks, "What shall I do? These people aren't listening to me. I'll send my beloved son. It may be they will reverence him when they see him." But when the husbandmen saw him, representing the nation of Israel at the time, they reasoned among themselves, saying, "This is the heir, come, let us kill him, that the inheritance may be ours." And they cast him out of the vineyard, they killed him. "What therefore shall the Lord of the vineyard do unto them? he shall come and destroy those husbandmen and shall give the vineyard to others. Jesus Christ foretold that the captivity that would come would be the direct result of their rejection of him. But he repeats this destruction in the very next chapter in a different context, in a warning to his own disciples. He says in verse 20 and 21, when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof that I spoke about in the previous chapter is nigh. Let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let them which are in the midst of it depart out. Let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. And these two verses themselves are remarkable. We don't have a great deal of time to look at them, but they show that there was going to be two attacks against Jerusalem following Jesus Christ's life. One would be a partial sacking of Jerusalem. There would be a warning to get out. And that, of course, happened when the Romans marched on Jerusalem under Titus, breached the temple wall in AD 68, retreated to allow Vespasian, his father, to travel back to Rome to be made emperor. And then upon his success there, Titus continued and he decimated the city in AD 70. Jews at that time were banned from entering Jerusalem. They became pariah the world over, outcast from their land, blamed for many social issues, as we've seen, forced from country to country by anti-Semitism for centuries, persecuted by religious authorities, persecuted by non-religious authorities. And as Christ went on further here in Luke 21 to explain, they shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So once again, though, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. This isn't a final scattering or a final captivity. Jerusalem would again be a capital for the Jews when the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled or finished. Christ here prophesies that this treading down would end. So where have we seen? What have we seen so far? The nation was taken captive, partly returned under Cyrus. They've now been taken captive again as prophesied by Christ with, at this point in Luke chapter 21, a future return back to the land prophesied. And obviously they did return. But how do we know there are going to be two returns? As I said earlier, we've got a second captivity and a third captivity. How do we know there's going to be a second return and a third return? Most of the Bible was written before AD 70. Well and truly before 1948. And while the Jews did return in 48-67, how can we distinguish in the Bible between that return and any subsequent captivity and return? How can we know that? How can we know which bit is what? How do we distinguish it? The answer is that there's a few key prophecies which tell us about what's classified in the Bible as the time of the end, or the latter days, and some places Armageddon. It speaks of a final worldwide war and calamity before God visibly intervenes in the world. And we know from these prophecies that Israel will be a nation in existence at the time, and that they will be taken captive again. So here we have proof that Israel is going to be in the land at the time of the end. In Ezekiel 38, after many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword. So speaking to an antagonist against God and against his people. It's set in the latter years. These people have been gathered out of many people. It's the story of the Jewish nation throughout time, against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste. But they are brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. You're going to take a spoil, take a prey upon the people that are gathered out of the nations. And verse 16, thou shalt come up against my people Israel as a cloud. It shall be in the latter days I will bring thee against my land. Now, Ezekiel is prophesying from Babylon in the first captivity. How do we know he's not referring to the destruction of Israel in AD 70? Because of this phrase, as I said, the latter days, latter years. And we have here on the screen some quotes that we're not going to visit tonight, But Daniel 2 verse 28 and 45 shows us that the latter years period is after the rulers of the Romans are gone. So we know that it's after AD 70, this latter year period. And in Daniel 8 verse 11, in conjunction with Daniel 11 verse 31, we see that the daily sacrifice, which was the sacrifices that happened in the Jewish temple, were going to be taken away upon the destruction of the temple. That happened in AD 70. But we know also from the end of Daniel 11 that this happened well before the time of the end. So AD 70 is not the destruction that is spoken of here in Ezekiel 38. Therefore, there will be another captivity of Israel. It's going to be future to us today. And we've seen two prophecies at this point. Luke chapter 20 and 21, the AD 70 captivity, and the 1948 return of Israel and Jerusalem. And we've seen Ezekiel 38, the future captivity of Israel once again. So with that being said, it's sometimes quite difficult to determine between the different restoration prophecies. How do we know which refers to each return? So we'll look at the obvious ones. And we looked at Luke chapter 21, as I mentioned. This chronologically follows, trodden down of the Gentiles until. And the next few verses tell us that this return happens before the return of the Lord Jesus Christ to the earth. Verse 24, Jerusalem shall be trodden down until. Verse 27, then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. This is a reference to Armageddon, the return of Jesus Christ and his entering into the political fray of the world. This is after the time period when the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled and Jerusalem is back in the hands of Israel. And this is where Theodor Herzl and the Zionist Foundation fit in. God, through them, was orchestrating this second return. He was laying the groundwork. Their role was a persuasive one. And we saw this role, if we read on in Jeremiah 16, our chapter for tonight. We saw that God tells of the captivity of his people and their return in Jeremiah 16, verse 13 to 15. How was this going to be accomplished? Well, verse 16, God would use influential people like Theodor Herzl to assist, like a fisherman, providing bait, convincing people that the only option to avoid the hunters that were going to come was a national homeland, and advocating hard for it. I will send for many fishers, saith the Lord, they shall fish them, and after will I send for many hunters. So remarkably, God used many influential people, including Theodor Herzl, and whole nations to bring the return of his people back into the land they once inhabited. 1,878 years had passed from AD 70 to the restoration of Israel. More than 93 generations of people, unprecedented in human history and prophesied by Jesus and the prophets before him. Evidence for the existence of a God at work. But not only that, evidence and confirmation in the final restoration prophecies. Because very few of us could kid ourselves that in the world today, in its current state, that Israel in its current state today is how God wants this to end. So what about this final restoration? Well, we already touched on the future captivity. We don't want to dwell on that tonight, except to say that there's a number of references. If you have a look at these references in your own time, these references speak about this future captivity. But let's talk big picture here about the plan of God as we did at the start. How does this captivity and restoration fit into God's plan? We saw at the beginning, God still has plans to convert his people Israel. He wants them to be obedient to him. Deuteronomy 29 told us that. Deuteronomy 30 told us that. This is part of it. We saw the cause of the captivity in AD 70 and the rejection of his son. We've seen how then more than 1,800 years of dispersion resulted, and finally a state has been born facilitated by God's work through people like Theodor Herzl. But that rejection continues. A rejection of Jesus Christ, and by extension, a rejection of God's plan to save them. We saw also that this third return was an indication of the biblical period referred to as the latter days, the time of the end. The huge war that is outlined in Ezekiel 38, we went to earlier, shows us that this will involve the final destruction of Israel and Jerusalem. Only for God to intervene and become involved through his Son and fight for his people. And at that time, they will accept Jesus Christ as their king. Effectively, the fortunes of the Jews will be merged with that of true Christians, along with the fortunes of the entire world, as Jesus Christ will establish, as we see in Daniel chapter 2, a worldwide rule. Let's look now at Ezekiel 39. This is obviously straight after Ezekiel 38. And we know that Ezekiel 38 is a battle of the latter days. And Ezekiel 39, verse 25 and 26, thus says the Lord God, now will I bring again the captivity of Jacob. Now will I bring again the captivity of Jacob and have mercy upon the whole house of Israel, and will be jealous for my holy name, after that they have borne their shame and all their trespasses whereby they have trespassed against me when they dwelt safely, and none made them afraid. And I don't know if you recall Ezekiel 38, verse 8, they shall dwell safely, all of them. This is a reference back to that. Further proof on top of the chronology of the chapters that this happens after the latter days captivity, when they dwelt safely in their land and none made them afraid. Verse 27, when I have brought them again from the people and gathered them and am sanctified in their midst, then shall they know that I am the Lord their God, which caused them to be led into captivity. But I have gathered them unto their own land, neither will I hide my face any more from them. For I have poured out my spirit upon the house of Israel, saith the Lord God. God indicates here that never again will there be captivity for his people. This will be the final return. And finally, the Jewish people will accept the most influential person God has ever used, Jesus Christ, as their king. We had up on the screen earlier, Zechariah chapter 12. In that day shall the Lord defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and he that is feeble among them at that day shall be as David, and the house of David shall be as God, as the angel of the Lord before them. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and of supplications. They shall look upon me whom they have pierced. A reference to Jesus Christ. And they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. At this point, I'd like to tell you to listen in next week, because there we'll be discussing this incredible and most influential person and king, Jesus Christ, soon to be king of the entire world. But in summary for our talk tonight, Theodor Herzl hoped and theorized that the establishment of a national homeland for the Jews would remove all anti-Semitism. We've seen tonight, though, that contrary to Herzl's dream, God's plan requires a final outpouring of that anti-Semitism on national Israel. I'll leave you with these articles, which were released 3 days ago, because they speak for themselves.